A big hello to all of you in Christ. This is Pastor Connor. One last, what do you call, orbit around the sun of sun not being the the ball of yellow gas or whatever it pretends to be, nor even the Son of God, as much as I would like to do so. But on the topic of bishops, right? This last disputed article in the Augsburg Confession, that is where we are, and we are in article, I think it's 28. And I believe that we technically counted it as starting at, I think, paragraph 70. I'm not actually sure if that's true or not, but I would like to go back to 67 here. And I want to do that just because, opening this piece up, Melanchthon says, hardly any of the ancient canons are observed according to the letter. Now, this, I think, is a crucial issue, and apologies for my sort of hesitancy to roll into this quickly because my laptop is lagging and having some trouble. I'm still trying to share the screen with you. But this is a big issue because, as it were, there are many Roman Catholics as well as many Lutherans who appreciate some of the beautiful and good things about our Roman Catholic, institutional mother. And they say, man, I wish we had something, something like the church canons. And I always tell them like we do. It's basically a church order document, and we do have them. Um, However, it's not going to save you because, as has been sort of, the tested, time-honored truth of eternal time, at least insofar as the Book of Concord records the matter. It mentions time and time again how notorious the Church of Rome was for not following her own canons. If you look in the Book of Concord, and you can just go into an index or you can use a search engine, like I'm using Logos Bible software, and type in like church canons or the canons of the church. And what you'll find is Luther and Melanchthon are not citing it saying this is a bunch of nonsense, we shouldn't bother with the church canons, but rather that our confessors are saying we are the ones who fight on the side of the canons of the church. We are the ones who are following the ancient traditions. And that, mind you, is in the spirit of the text of those canons, not necessarily in the letter. And this comes up as well. And I think this is crucial, right? Not only because it gets at what Melanchthon's saying here when he says, hardly any of the church canons are observed according to their letter, but many of their rules fall daily into complete disuse, even among those who observe such ordinances most diligently. But he says that because these things are meant to be lived and practiced in institutional communities, less than they are to be held as eternal precepts for all of time in the way that a moral principle is. In the same way that, let me give an example. The Nazarite vow is not a moral principle for all people, but similar to the food laws that we talked about in our last episode, in the distinction of sorry, I don't want to confuse you and think we're talking about the article in the Augustana about the distinction of meats. But in the same article concerning bishops, Melanchthon talking about the distinction between clean and unclean foods, about the eating of blood and food sacrificed to idols and things like this, that this is not an eternal precept, principle, but a temporal precept given in a context for a specific purpose. As such, there's nothing immoral about drinking wine, but the Nazarites who took that vow could not do it. There is nothing immoral about shaving the sides of your head, or the corners of your head, but the Jews in the Old Covenant of Moses were not permitted to do it. There's nothing fundamentally immoral about wearing mixed fabrics, but I'm doing it right now, right? However, the Jews at that time were not permitted to do it. And so, in this same sort of way, then, when we talk about the canons of the church, we are not just talking about a principle that says this is good church order for this time, but we're also talking about morality in a general sense, even the way that it works in divine scripture, right? Such that the Mosaic covenantal people of God were required not to light a fire, not to cook any food upon the Sabbath, right? However, is there anything fundamentally immoral with doing that? No, other than that God commanded you not to and that you still did it, right? But there's nothing eternal about this principle. right? What there is a fundamental particularity to that ethical precept. And that's flowing from an ethical principle, which itself is eternal. And maybe this confuses some people, but I think I would wager that this is actually a helpful way to understand things. So then when we apply that to church order, a lot of people, because they don't understand what I just said, they will then go and say, because the Book of Concord calls this adiaphora, because it's not commanded in Holy Scripture, because of this and that and the other thing, that you can't actually be requiring church order for anything. Well, that's not true either, right? Because even though there's nothing fundamentally immoral about not wearing vestments at church, and this is going to ruffle a lot of people's feathers, there is something immoral about going against the common grain or the tradition of the fathers because you don't like them, because you don't think that they're necessary, because you want to be different. There is something fundamentally immoral about destroying a comfort and a unity which otherwise would have. Now, people will also try and make the same sort of argument in the other way and say, well, if there's a church that wants to lean more of an evangelical way, because this is an issue of adiaphora, and because you said there's something immoral about not wanting to take their comfort away, we have to also posit that in the distinction between the great tradition and the local tradition. Now, this is not saying, for example, that there is something fundamentally immoral about preaching a sermon or leading divine service in a t-shirt and shorts, right? There isn't. But there may be something that becomes immoral due to the context of that situation. Now, if you don't understand that, then you actually don't understand the adiaphora distinction and probably shouldn't be invoking it in arguments, right? Just because, and I know this, what I say now is probably going to confuse so many people who've been taught um, what they think is simple and easy to understand, but actually they've never understood any of it in the first place. When I say this, um, whether or not God has explicitly commanded or something or not does not make it morally acceptable or not. Okay? Again, God did explicitly say to the Jews, you cannot wear mixed fabrics. There is now nothing immoral for you to do that, right? God did say to the Jews, you must not eat shellfish. There is nothing immoral about you doing that right now, right? In the same way, and we all know these arguments, and I'm pretty sure that we all kind of grasp this ethic at the end of the day, but maybe it's just that we don't understand, a lot of us don't understand the fundamental inner workings of this. When I say it's immoral to get high on cocaine, look, God never said don't do that. We all know it's immoral to do that, right? And so when people might get offended by the way I said it, but that is what's true, right? It's not just about divine command theory ethic. Maybe we should also perhaps for the common masses do a little bit of an episode sometime on the different schools of ethical thought, because you don't just have divine command theory. It's not as simple as God said it, I believe it, that settles it. Right? That does work with divine revelation, but not all of ethic is specially revealed in that sense. It is also naturally revealed. And that doesn't make it any less divine. It just makes it, the term would be special as opposed to a general revelation, or supernatural revelation as opposed to natural revelation, right? And with this comes natural law, right? So here's a good example of this. When we look at the morality or immorality of the use of contraceptions, right? And this is, I'll do this, I'll do you a favor here and I'll bridge together divine, not command, well, I guess, yeah, sure, divine command theory, but also a kind of exemplarist, rooted in goodness kind of definition of what God is and what goodness is. And also, you look at natural law, right? So we understand, I'm probably going to surprise some people here, but traditionally, none of the churches that existed thought contraceptions were morally permissible. This is a very recent thing within the last about 100 years that comes from the Anglicans, right? The Anglicans always giving people of the world, that which they want, but not necessarily that which is good for them. They were the first ones to say, yeah, this is okay, this is permissible. Before that, nobody thought so. Right now, it's very common for a lot of people to think so, and they'll say, so long as it's not abortion, or so long as it's not abortifacient, or so long as it's not this and that and the other thing. I would say to this, you go back to, obviously, to natural law. What is the sexual intimate act designed for? Well, it's designed for procreation. So to go against its very nature, this is outside of natural, it's against natural order, and thus it is against natural law. The natural law is according to the natural design of the thing. And people would say that's a little bit shallow for me. Okay, well, let's go a little bit deeper here. Um, we look at the exemplary goodness of God, right? Which is, obviously God is the source of all goodness. He is goodness itself. We find that he is the standard, the measuring rod of all goodness. He is the one who says, think here, Creed, Apostles' Creed, Article 1, and Small Catechism explanation of that article. I believe in the Father, maker, or creator, should probably be said, of heaven and earth, all things seen and unseen, visible, invisible, to invoke our Nicene Creed there. And well, what does that mean? Was ist das? Or was heißt das, depending on which sort of text you're reading. You'll get this idea that Luther says that God has given me all that I have. My reason, my senses, my body, my soul, my eyes, still takes care of them. He's given me house, home, food, clothing, shoes, a good spouse, good friends, good government, good weather, so on, so on, so on, so on, so on. And that he does this all out of his fatherly divine goodness and mercy without any worthiness or merit in me and myself. He does it because he loves me. What's the root of that? The root of that is the creation of humanity. And you'll understand this if you actually have read or bought a copy of my commentary on the Large Catechism, the first volume of that series, which is on the introduction and the Decalogue, in which I talk about the need to understand legal ethics, biblical legal ethics, according to the exemplary goodness of God, exhibited in and of himself through his own work, and that the law is rooted in the good newses of God, right? So this first good news of God is his creation of life. This is one of the greatest miracles of life and the closest that we can get, aside from, let's say, the forgiveness of sins, the restoration of the soul, and the resurrection of the dead on the last day. This is one of those, tied up together with those other two, that is the closest we can get to God when he conceives a new nephesh, a new living being, a soul, within and through the flesh of two of his servants, right? It's not, Adam and Eve having a child. It is God creating a child through and with Adam and Eve, right? That is not only good, that is God, right? And I'm not saying the child is God, but God is there making the child. He is doing that act, and he's doing it through you. If you want to say it this way, it is sacramental, not in a forgiveness of sins way, but this is a miraculous work of God through which God is doing impossible, unimaginable, merciful, gracious things in this world that are taking place through matter, and the sharpest form of matter, which is closest to human beings, which is our own flesh and blood, right? So, in that sense, not only are we saying when we use contraceptives, I'm going to act against my nature, and I'm going to violate the nature of the act itself that I'm trying to engage in, but secondly, we're saying to this greatest miracle of God, I do not want to be a participant in this. And moreover, I do not want the fruit of that to be present in this world. I do not want more lives to exist. I do not want God to be God to another person. I do not want more of God's work in the world. I do not want God to be God, because in a sense, this is the beginning of his being God in a subjective and objective sense to individuals. So when we say that, and this will sound very sharp, and I'm not saying that, we should roll this out overnight and say, well, this is our new, church's modus operandi, and everybody that doesn't agree with what I've just said about contraception is excommunicated if they're unrepentant. Absolutely nothing like this. But what it is to say is that the church has made a fundamental flaw philosophically in regard to ethics when it has said that these things cannot be forbidden because they're not commanded. And even on that sense, let me go and show you where it's commanded. People say, oh, you're going to go to the sin of Onan. This is such a weak argument. No, I'm not going to the sin of Onan. I'm going to our own confessions, which cite, and we've already seen this in our series on the Augustana, as well as, we're going to see this again in the Large Catechism. And if you own my commentary on the Large Catechism, you'll see it there too. But Luther in his works, as well as Melanchthon, talking about this aspect of marriage, say it is not actually a thing that you can or cannot do. And procreation is tied up to that, not as a thing that you can or cannot do. But they read this as an imperative. When God says, of Adam and Eve. For this reason, man will leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they will become one flesh. And he says to them, be fruitful and multiply. And we say, that's not an imperative. It doesn't get any more imperative than that. Secondly, to that, your own confessions cite it as an imperative, not in one place, in several places, right? Now, there are exceptions to this, such as the celibate people, which Luther and Melanchthon refer to as those who are specially gifted by God, which our modern society will now call asexuals. And that's fine. But most people, as our own confessions say, they're not in that camp. So, again, should we start disciplining people for this? No, I don't think so. I think the church needs to be slower, more careful, more deliberate in her philosophical taking back of ground from people's minds in the battle with the world that we're waging. But what we need to do first is realize how big our philosophical and ethical mistakes have been. Okay, this gets back then to, I know it's roundabout, talking about sex, talking about ethics, when really I'm supposed to be talking about canon law. Getting back to canon law, having canon law won't help you if you don't follow canon law. And this the same goes with what I just said. It's not that the church doesn't have this ethic. You read any book before the mid 1900s, they all say that. They all say the same thing. There's one Christian ethic on sexuality, one Christian ethic on procreation, one Christian ethic on marriage, one Christian ethic on contraceptives. It is not different. There's no broad spectrum of disagreement. It's one until the 1930s and Anglicans. So having that there did not help us. Why did it not help us? Because the church decided to disregard it. In the same way, what does Melanchthon say? Hardly any of the ancient canons are observed according to the letter. Sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes that's not a good thing, right? You read, for example, Nicaea 1. And what, people like to say, no one should ever claim to hold, outside of the Eastern Orthodox, no one should ever claim to hold to the Seventh Ecumenical Council. That's the Second Council of Nicaea. And, I guess I'm a little bit infamous for saying I actually quite like that council. I quite like, even saying that those who reject images of Christ can't be Christians. And people would say, well, you're making, again, the adiaphora required. No, it's just speaking, in a sense of a posteriori examinations. What kind of person is rejecting an image of Christ? What kind of person is hostile to a crucifix? It's either going to be a Calvinist or it's going to be somebody who says, I do not want a depiction of the crucifixion. I would rather have a depiction of an empty cross. They'll often say, which reminds me of the resurrection. Is there something inherently necessary about believing that images of the crucifixion are good? Not in a commanded sense, but I think in an examined sense, yes. And when we see people who are hostile to icons, hostile to paintings because they depict their own faith, I think there's a huge cognitive dissonance there that needs to be examined more. And they'll say things like, yeah, but the Second Council of Nicaea also said you have to have relics in the altars, or graveyards under the church. Do I think that? No, I don't think that. But in the same way, the same people who claim that therefore I can't hold to Nicaea 2 say they hold to Nicaea 1 when they, if they're pastors, have not followed the regulations there, nor have their predecessors, nor will their successors. And if they're not, then according to that Nicene Council, they don't have faithful pastors and they need to get rid of them and cast them out of the church. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, go to the Council of Nicaea and look at what it talks about regarding clergy who sin. Okay? Look at the Council of Nicaea in regard to bowing, kneeling on Sundays. These to those of us who know about these things, these are not big issues. To those who think that the council must be held inviolable in 100% of its text because no aspect of it was contextual, they're going to have serious difficulties. But they're not only going to have difficulties with the councils from Nicaea 1 to Nicaea 2, they're going to have issues with the Book of Concord's exegesis in this article and in others. They're going to have issues with the Holy Scriptures when it says don't eat pork. They're going to have a lot of issues with a whole lot of things. And why are they going to? Well, because they're trying to make it, I'll just say it this way, simpler than it is. And that doesn't mean it's not simpler. It means that you can't say, for example, that since God said it, that there is no contextual binding to it as a precept, but it has to be an eternal principle. We fundamentally know that is not the case. We fundamentally know it's not the case. And we know it's also not the exegesis of the Book of Concord. And we also know it's not the way that the early church, the conciliar church from Nicaea 1 to Nicaea 2, it's not the way that they carried out their faith. And so the text of canon law, the text of biblical ethics, and the spirit thereof are not one and the same. The text serves the spirit, right? And this is not a liberal thing to say. Let me give you an example here, right? There's been many great scholars writing commentaries on biblical law and Leviticus from a Christian perspective. And how do they do that? Do they say these are a bunch of things that don't matter at all? No, they pull away at the precept to get behind the principle. Well, what is the principle behind the idea of tabernacle? What's that principle of God's nearness with his people, right? His tabernacling in physical form in the earth. Well, where's that fulfilled? It's fulfilled in Christ. You look at the principles behind the sacrifice, the principles of atonement. Yes, in that context, it's through an animal. We know from the book of Hebrews that could never actually forgive any sins, right? But it was given for the atonement of the sins of the people in a civil form, right? But that precept is fulfilled now through the blood of Jesus Christ. Again, if you don't understand these, you're not just having an issue with what I'm saying about the helpfulness or lack thereof helpfulness of canon law between spirit and letter. What I'm saying is you're going to have issues reading the text of Scripture, the text of the conciliar church, the text of the Lutheran confessions, and you fundamentally need to start back at square one, right? At least ethically, because that's simply not how any of these ethics are working. I don't know of any divine command theory that does work that way. Perhaps if there is one, we could say, well, it may be in some sort of Islamic school, but I would guarantee you, even if that's so, it would not be the only Islamic school and probably not even the majority one, right? This is not how decent and good ethics are carried out. So while it's good to have canon law and church order, and indeed we do. So people say, I wish we had canon law. We do, right? I wish we valued canon law. We do. And this is why when you use your index, your search engine, to look for canon law or the church canons or the canons of the church in the Book of Concord, in the Augsburg Confession, it is always in a positive light. And people, they say, well, why don't we have them? We do. But it's not for laity to be perusing. It doesn't mean you cannot. It means that you simply do not, are not, usually will not, right? But, if you go to, for example, any Lutheran Synod, Wisconsin, Missouri, Lutheran Church Canada, Canadian Association, ELCA, you'll find it there. Go to the website and look at the documents, the CTCR documents, and, the committees go with different names in different groups. But go there and look at them. Look at what they talk about. Are they there? Yes. Are they applied and required? I would say, people would say, no. Well, yes and no. It depends, right? You can have the text, but unless the text is enforced by the local governor of that area, let's say a circuit councilor, let's say it's a district president, let's say it's a synod president, if it's not enforced, it doesn't matter that it's there. If it is enforced, it doesn't matter that it's not there, right? Having the text there can be helpful, but only when it's used, and only for the sake of bringing unity to how the church is governed and kept unified. Now, people say again, but isn't it adiaphora? Yes, and that's actually the point. The point of church order is to govern in a unified way and to organize in a unified way for the sake of church unity in matters that God did not command, nor forbid, nor attach his promise of redemption to. It is things like, for example, requiring pastors to get background checks. Should we do that? I'm going to say, absolutely we should do that. God didn't say we should, but absolutely we should. Should churches have, for example, insurance? Yes, absolutely. Now, people say, well, you can't require that because God didn't require that. Do you realize what you're saying? You're saying church bodies can't require pastors to have background checks, that church bodies can't require congregations to have insurance, that church bodies can't require priests, clergy, pastors to be doing the liturgy wearing clothes, that he can show up naked because God didn't say he couldn't. These, really, the argument, people say, well, that's not our argument. Fundamentally, that is your argument. You didn't say that, and you're going to say, well, you're taking it way out of context. Yes, I am, because you don't see what your argument actually is until you see it in its fully fleshed form, which is that anything that God didn't command, I can't command. That anything God didn't command, that the Synod President can't say is required, right? There are things which are required, not by God, but by men, not for the sake of salvation, but for the sake of goodness in this world, right? And so if we don't understand this, it's your fault, right? There's not an issue with the teaching. This is how society runs, right? And it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing, right? It's a good thing. So when we say, do we have church order? Should we have church order? Yes. Now the question of, well, how restrictive should it be? That's a different issue, right? Should we be saying that we need to get rid of, for example, all other liturgical texts other than DS3? No, I don't think that we should. But all of these synods have required a specific service book, either the LSB together with the TLH or the LW for LCMS and LCC, and then the Christian worship in its different forms for the Wisconsin Synod, right? Did they do that? Yes, they did. People who, let's say LCMS Facebook group, a lot of the people commenting there would be shocked to actually find out what the documents actually do say, right? Again, is that the document's fault? No, no, because the document, again, it's not saying you can only be saved through the LSB, or you can only be saved through the TLH, or you can only be saved in Wisconsin through the Christian worship hymnal. Nothing like this. But saying, for example, for the sake of unity and church order, we will agree to use these resources. Why? Because these are the ones that have been vetted by our doctors, by our teachers, by our pastors, by our episcopal overseers, and so on. Okay? As simple as that, really, to be honest. So don't overthink it, but do understand it. Alrighty. Anyway, he says here again, many of these rules that are in church order, canon law, they regularly fall into complete disuse. Why? Because they're no longer helpful. They're no longer useful, right? Here's a good one for you. Back in the Novatian controversy, and I know everybody who's watching said, no, keep going with the text because we have to finish. But hold on. Back in the day with the Novatian controversy and the purists, the Cyprian camp, they were talking about, for example, when somebody in persecution abandons the faith just to survive, how can they possibly be allowed back in the church? They said they never can. And then you had the liberals who said, you can let them in, just make sure that they repent and so on. But the church's actual position, which excommunicated both of these groups, it said to them, you can come in, but I believe it's not if you did the full thing. And I did write an article on this, so you can go and you can reference it. It does have the correct citations and sources there. But I believe it was, for example, like if you suffered in jail, but not crucifixion, then you can come back. But if you just full sail left the faith on the grounds of going to jail, then you can't come back ever, right? This is not acceptable to today's church, right? That's in Nicaea 1. That's the decision, okay? So this isn't just regarding, for example, about the ideas of canon law and church order. This is also like there's overlap. I'm not saying it's totally theology, but there's an overlap with theology that's happening here. And in the same sort of way, the ideas of, for example, the necessities and requirements of having bishops in the way that we've even discussed here already, or of how we would judge a pastor as having a valid call, this and that and the other thing. There is overlap with doctrine. There is overlap with eternal things, but we don't look at that and say, that really was true back then. Well, it was true in a church order sense, but it was never true in a theological sense, okay? So, not only do those rules of canon law fall into disuse, some of the declarations that they declared as true are universally rejected later on, okay? And a lot of people, they just don't grapple with, they don't wrestle with this. Whose fault is that? I would say it's probably their fault. Okay? Now, consciences can neither be counseled nor helped unless we keep this moderation in mind. And it is a moderation of having church order, of having canon law, but using it properly and only when it is helpful and good and in accordance with the scriptures. That such ordinances are not to be considered necessary, that is, for salvation, and even disregarding them does no harm to consciences. Okay, bishops could easily foster obedience if they did not insist on the observance of ordinances that cannot be observed without sin. This is a very easy task to apply. Okay, now I think again we have to realize how far gone we are mentally, philosophically, theologically from the writer of this, because the writer of this understands one of those chief things as being the forbidding of marriage and therefore procreation together with that marriage, right? And so when the bishop is saying you are forbidden from getting married because you're a priest or because you're a nun or because you're a this and a that, I think that we have to wrestle with the fact that Melanchthon was only able to take that into consideration because he had a robust enough ethic to fight against what was happening. But oftentimes, we do not have that today. And so when we try to say things like Melanchthon is saying here, oftentimes we end up simply defaulting to, well, God never said that, which fundamentally, as I've been saying, that is a weak argument insofar as other arguments are concerned. And we need to be a little bit more careful on saying, okay, well, how can we also sort of build up at the beginning of this sort of task of philosophizing through the good of what is actually good and how do we chase it. Now, obviously, Melanchthon is rooting this down into divine command theory, but when we reduce it to that, we understand nothing, right? Of course, because what about the shrimp? You saw already in his exegesis of that text, he doesn't understand it to be a simple reduction to divine command as eternal. Okay? Something else is going on here. But if we don't have that scaffolding, we cannot build the structure. Okay? Now, he says bishops can foster obedience if they don't insist on first of all, doing things that aren't sin and not doing things that are sin, or however you would say that. Doing things that are sin and not doing things and forbidding things which are good. Okay? That's how we'll say that. Okay? So forbidding marriage, which is he says, a good thing, right? He says, now they engage in prohibiting both kinds of the sacrament, and this idea of both kinds of the sacrament is the Holy Eucharist, forbidding this, which is commanded by Christ in the holy institution of the sacrament of the altar. But he says also, and prohibiting marriage for the clergy, because sorry, my computer's lagging again here, because they admit no one to the ministry who refuses to swear an oath to that celibacy. So these are sorts of the issues that are rolling around in Melanchthon's mind here. And again, this comes back to what's Melanchthon's concern been through this entirety of the Augsburg Confession. From start to end, it's not actually been, well, they said something God didn't say, or they said something that goes even against the idea of sola scriptura or something, or it pushes against adiaphora. No, it's always law and gospel. It's always law and gospel. It's saying you're calling something which is good that which is a sin, and requiring me not to do what God has already commanded me to do, and you're commanding me to do something that God has never said to do, which is against what God has said to do, and saying I'll be forgiven by doing it, by meriting righteousness. Okay? So his concern is the gospel of Christ and the law of God. Now he says, desiring that the bishops restore peace, unity at the expense of their honor and dignity would be an easy way to bring people back into alignment and faithfulness under those bishops. He says, these churches of the Augsburg Confession ask only that bishops relax certain unreasonable burdens which do not exist in the former times of the church and yet were adopted in the later accretions, as Calvin Ortland would say, okay? So this idea is getting at that aspect of Lutheranism, which a lot of people don't understand, never knew, or they've forgotten, which is that Lutheranism is not Catholicism. It is early Catholicism. It is ancient Christianity that, whether you disagree with its succeeding or not, its intention was to go back to the form of Christianity of the early church. And how do we know that? Because it repeatedly says so in its own statements, such as, we ask only that the bishops relax, not even get rid of, relax unreasonable burdens which did not exist in the church in former times, to go back to the foundational principles of the early church. Okay, perhaps there were some reasons for introducing these things, he even says, these later accretions, but they're no longer helpful and they're not in tune with our times. Now, we want to be careful here and say, when he says they're not in tune with our times, we don't want to say, you guys just need to get with the times, and now we can start ordaining women and marrying two boys and stuff. Nothing like this whatsoever is in mind here. What he means in tune with our times is the contextual precept is not necessary because that contextual binding is no longer there. Such as, for example, why was the marrying of priests forbidden in the medieval church? Well, it wasn't actually forbidden for the purpose of celibacy. If you look at those documents, it was perfectly permitted and even, encouraged that not only pastors but also bishops would take a concubine, right, and live with them as their wife, but outside of holy matrimony. And that they would do this because what was happening was that people were becoming priests to inherit a bunch of property, and then they were passing it down to their children away from the church. And this is what was attempted to be stopped. And also, from this, attempting to be stopped was that people would be becoming priests, not for worldly gain, but for the love of Christ. Okay, but was that in tune with the times that Melanchthon's writing in? No, not because the world had changed its values, but because that contextual issue was no longer relevant. And, if it was even ever relevant, if that was even ever a valid way to fix that, I would say no, right? And he says, now, can it be denied that some ordinances were adopted without being understood? Absolutely. He says, accordingly, the bishop should be so gracious as to temper these ordinances, since such change does not harm the unity of the Christian church. And this goes back to Augsburg 7 and 8. It's not actually necessary that these external forms of the church, that the church order, that the liturgies of the church be absolutely uniform in every aspect and every place. For many ordinances divided by human beings have fallen into disuse with the passing of time and need not be observed, as papal law itself testifies. Again, citing papal law. Why? Because the Lutheran Church was not against papal law. The Lutheran Church was not against canon law. The Lutheran Church was actually, in many cases, citing it as a decent and good thing, which should be looked at more by Rome, which was going off doing its own thing. The real problem that Lutherans had originally with Rome was that it kept innovating. It kept changing. It kept developing. And they make a lot of stink about trying to defend the doctrine of development, so-called. But we say, when you have a doctrine of development that's developing away from the foundation, you don't have building, you have moving. You don't have, let's say, an upward progression. You have an outward progression away from where you started, away from what you were handed, away from tradition, because tradition means handed down, right? Now you're just not only you're not reconstructing even, you're constructing. It's a constructive, creative theology. It is not a traditional theology. If, however, this is impossible and permission cannot be obtained from them to moderate and abrogate such human ordinances as can be observed without sin, then we must follow the apostolic rule which commands us to obey God rather than human beings. So they asked for permission to just have these things relaxed. It's not given. So then Melanchthon says, and the churches did, obey God rather than men, when there is a contradiction between the two. He did try to play ball. He did try to get an agreement. He did try to get relaxation on these issues. Did not happen. Did not come. And so we have it. St. Peter prohibits the bishops to rule as if they had the power to force the churches to do whatever they desired in 1 Peter 5:2. He cites this, and it reads here. Did he say 5:2? I think, yeah. God that is among you exercising oversight not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, as were those priests in the medieval era doing, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples of the flock. And all of this is, of course, rooted in love and for love for the sake of love. Okay? So he says then, now the question is not how to take power away from bishops. He doesn't want to do that. He never wanted to do that. I forget what the podcast is, but it was like a year or two ago, and I believe it was some kind of Orthodox podcast. I think it might have been a Coptic Orthodox podcast, which, I do quite often like Coptic Orthodox theology podcast thinking. I do find them actually generally quite good, but this one was just totally incorrect, totally out of left field, saying Luther and the Lutheran Reformation intended to get rid of the priesthood and the bishops. That's not true. How do we know that? Because our own documents say fundamentally that's not true, right? The idea was never take power away from bishops. The idea was tell the bishops to do what they were supposed to be doing the entire time and keeping the traditions of the church static and steady, right? To go back to the early church former model and remove the abusive accretions of latter time, which have corrupted the earlier tradition of the church. He says, instead, we desire and ask that they would not force consciences into sin. But if they would not do so and despise this request, let them consider when they have will to answer to God, since they, by their obstinacy, cause division and schism. Right? Again, who's the one causing the schism? Who's the one breaking the church apart? Many will say it's the Lutherans, not according to the Lutheran documents. Right? Now you look at the Roman documents of the same. Right? People will say, but Rome also, obviously, didn't think it was causing schism. That's not actually true, right? Because Rome is the one who had the power to pull the trigger and to break the church apart and to excommunicate these congregations. Now you will notice in the Augsburg Confession, never once is there a statement of an excommunication against Rome. There is a request to simply stop punishing the truth. That's all. This is Lutheranism. God bless you.